G'day. No rose-colored glasses here is a paper about Australian agency staff views on community responsibility, risk and resilience in the bushfire safety landscape. The paper is for the IASNR RM conference, virtual conference in July 2020. The methods used in the acquisition of the data that forms the basis for this paper was 18 in-depth, semi-structured interviews. The paper is part of a bigger project, which included 42 community-based interviews and 7 professional experts from Europe, South Africa, and the United States of America. The paper is in 2 parts. We're looking at part 1, social policy on shared responsibility and community resilience from the standpoint of the agency employees who are meant to be rolling it out, and part 2, how the National Disaster Framework, which is a management and strategic document, implicates what they do. Part 1 then, the social policy. The most important thing to think about is the way in which shared responsibility and community resilience are really about society relations and the role of citizens in relation to the state. Arguably, there's been a devolution of responsibility from the state to its institutions, and this requires that the institutions take on the role of organizing social behavior, encouraging the reasonable citizen. Shared responsibility programs in this slide are not new in the Australian context and around the world in liberal democratic countries, where they've been used in community health and education most notably, and in Australia among Indigenous communities for many years. One of the problems that we face right away when looking at the kind of social policy antecedents is what the institutions are that are implicated in bringing forth these policies versus the kinds of people that the institutions normally hire and that run them. So we have fireys, for example, the people who fight the fires, engineers, technical personnel, and scientists who are asked to organize social policy, community engagement, community development through shared responsibility and community resilience motifs. And that's the confusion that this could cause is obvious in things like the kind of indiscriminate language in some of the documentation. So industry, communities, stakeholders, partners are generally poorly defined. And all of these speak on the one hand to the government's uncertain or deliberate, hard to know, decision to have these kinds of social policies implicated throughout their fire programs. So social policy is shaping fire policy, promotion of shared responsibility in resilient communities, and that requires that communities, citizens be compliant with these ideas through the fire programs. The ideal would be for shared responsibility and resilient communities to be co-defined and co-negotiated within communities, but like I said, because there's a lot of confusion about what those communities are, it's not always clear what's really intended to happen. The ideal, one would think, is also for there to be an understanding of risk, and as we talk about this later in the paper, risk is being constantly renegotiated here. So issues that arise as a consequence of these sorts of assumptions are that the fire institutions and emergency management institutions' needs for compliant citizens who will do what they're told, or at least understand what the purpose of risk or what the definition of risk is from the fire's perspective, is a separate thing from everything else that's going on in society. But of course, what we see is that there are structural inequities that are the result of over 30 years of budget austerity. There are individual human nature and behavior differences. There are heterogeneous communities. And so what you get is a disconnect between the aims of the institutions and the realities of rolling it out on ground. Not only that, there's a certain kind of binary that develops wherein agency personnel start to think that, well, if people won't take the good oil, then they're self-marginalizing or deliberately excluding themselves. And from the citizen point of view, what happens is this becomes not the problem of society or the government, but the problem of the individual. So we wanted to backtrack on that just a little bit and sort of trace the origins of this kind of transition from liberal democratic to neoliberal thinking with regard to social policy programs. And it seems like the Tony Blair third way in the 90s, when Anthony Giddens came up with the autotelic self, is maybe a place we could point to. The individual who can transform threats into challenges, and their reward is to feel they've accomplished something. Remember, in the 90s, Blair is trying to get people to leave behind social welfare state and take on self-actualization and a sense of fulfillment by going out to work. Making sure there's a job, of course, was part of that. So in our case, we could say that the autotelic self would say, I'm sharing responsibility. It's my mutual obligation to share responsibility. And as such, individuals become vested in programs and they contribute to order. And but when you think about it, you're either in it or you're not. So it's what Chandler calls creating a binary between culpability and responsibility. So now we're going to part two, the National Disaster Framework. And the first thing maybe to note is that there's shared responsibility between and among agencies. There's shared responsibility between agencies and communities. But there's also the fact that the disaster risk framework is really a management strategy. So it's not really designed as a community engagement strategy. So even though everything centers on the community in shared responsibility, however imagined, and community resilience, there's still this idea that there's a devolution of responsibility to individuals, and it's individuals in events rather than processes and systems, so things are not connected to other things that are going on. And what you also see is, because the history of these organizations is very much in the engineers and the technical background, that people within these organizations feel most comfortable when they're interpreting working together as things like managing vegetation and combustibles on properties, checking for alarms in community buildings, and so on. And of course, the expectation that people will evacuate when they're told to do so. So these tensions show how the fire services is not really well equipped for social policy delivery. They need to create the aspiration for shared responsibility. They need to then create the behavior, and then they want to be able to reward the behavior. But instead, what they're actually going about and doing is saying, you need to be a resilient community because actually you can't depend on us to show up with a fire truck anymore, because we just don't have the kinds of institutional systems that can support the kinds of fires that we're going to have in the future. So therefore, the fire services community engagement programs are kind of in a no-win situation. And not only that, in order to be well funded, they have to prove that they've been successful. And the only way that you can demonstrate resilience is during or after a fire or a flood event. And as the last quotation on this slide shows, the people who are actually charged with implementing these sorts of things realize that the results could be 5 or 10 years down the road and not immediate. So government is going to find it hard to tick the boxes. And there are time lags, and also there's a problem with trust and credibility on both sides. So what to do? Well, what we find in the first instance is you create new stories. So quite a few of our respondents talked about the opportunity for shared responsibility, the ability to accept risk, to understand it, to be responsible for yourself and your own property, and to be your own decision maker. And by implication, if you're not doing that, then as Donald Trump would say, you're kind of a loser. But it's also therefore necessary to create the stories of non-compliance. And these become a kind of self-fulfilling, self-justifying loop. So, don't come whinging when the truck didn't turn up in your driveway because your property is completely overgrown. So this argument extends to, or verifies in a way, legitimates in a way, the idea that people are responsible for creating their own risk. But again, remember there's different definitions of risk. So in our community interviews, people tend to accept a certain amount of risk as just being part of daily life. But when in the fire agencies, risk is something that's calculable and often objective. So those communities that are being labeled as non-compliant, non-participatory, non-cooperative often have at their core different understandings or different interpretations of risk. And communities that are labeled too fractured or too fragmented may in fact be communities that are physically depopulated or new networked, or are acting in ways that may be coherent for some things but not for others. And so you get this kind of chaotic scenario. Now, I want to make the point that our respondents all acknowledge the variety of people in the community and that they understand that there's diversity in response. But they have very little way of responding to that diversity, partly because they're usually very badly funded, less than 10% of the fire service budget in each state. In a show of hands at a meeting, indicated that they had less than 10% budget for community engagement, and that community engagement includes the technical checking on things like community structures. Also, community groups that are very proactive and want to do something have to apply for funding, and they may only get funding for 1 or 2 years when we understand that these sorts of programs take longer. The number of fire service community engagement officers per state is also generally a handful, relying on volunteers and collaboration among many institutions. We looked at this word recreancy because it kind of echoed what we heard among communities about the fact that they weren't sure that the people that they expected to take responsibility and behave to fulfill obligations merited trust. And then in turn, we found within the institutions that they too thought that there might be recreancy all around. That is, that they didn't know that they could trust communities to do what they were told. There's really incommensurable worldviews between EM agencies and community members, so there's lots of goodwill. EM agencies generally want residents to be ever ready for a fire and to make it a central issue of living. Most residents just see it as part of the many things they have to deal with in their daily lives. Emergency response agencies are inherently conservative, and they are intrinsically wedded to the command and control orientation. And even though we think climate change will force a different approach, how that works out is not so clear. We mused among ourselves that perhaps if community engagement as social policy is to be the essential feature of disaster risk management, then empowering local governments with adequate resources to build community capacity is probably a much better way of evolving shared responsibility and resilient communities across the whole spectrum of things that need to change. Thank you.